Hey guys, Danny Johnson here, and today we're installing this Mcleod RXT twin disc clutch into our 2004 SVT Cobra. Now this is a 26 spline clutch, and so we already installed the 26 spline input shaft, so check the video description for that video. And on this one we're going to have to also be changing our pivot ball stud length to make sure that it fits properly, since this clutch does come out a little bit deeper than a stock clutch, being a twin disc clutch. So here's the part number on this one. This is for a 2004 SVT Cobra 8-bolt crank. So the flywheel is going to be 8-bolt, and so it's the 633-5807M. So that's the model number that we're looking at today. It's going to be for a 26 spline input shaft, and here's the input shaft alignment tool. You'll notice 26 teeth on that, 26 spline. You're going to need a 1/2 inch and a 14 millimeter socket in order to disassemble this. And so we're going to go ahead and start doing this. I decided to get a bunch of Ziploc bags and label everything. It's probably not too important on the pressure plate nuts because it's just the nut, the lock washer, and the regular washer, but it is important with shims on the other pieces. So my recommendation is to put all of the hardware in individual labeled bags. So I'm going to take this mark here and say bolt 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so basically that's how I'm going to count this. You could do it however you want. So I'm going to rotate the flywheel, and I'm going to use the alignment mark as basically the center line. I'm going to go clockwise and go ahead and take out these. Now I'm also going to take them off in opposite directions. The crisscross star pattern, I'll be using a 14 millimeter socket for this. It really shouldn't matter the order you take them off, but torquing them down, you want to go in the star pattern across from itself. So we're going to go ahead and just use that same method here. This one was even on light enough that you'll notice it just basically came off hand tight, because again, it's not assembled to go on the car yet. So we're going to go ahead and remove this nut here, and right under it you'll notice there is a crush washer. So the crush washer has a little slit in it. Okay, so that's the one that goes on next. And then under that we have this gold color washer as well. So that's going to be the orientation for all these. Again, I kind of went crisscross and removed them in a star pattern, even though that really shouldn't matter for removing it, but that's just what I wanted to do. Okay, so again, here's what you have for the pressure plate. Okay, at least the top part of the pressure plate, and these are studs that are coming out from the flywheel, and they have the little hex on the top, so you can take those out if you wanted to. But with all of these 6 removed, we're going to go ahead and lift the pressure plate off of the rest of the arrangement here. Okay, we're going to flip this upside down and gently put it down over here. You don't want to touch any of that surface area. You want to keep it clean of grease and everything. Okay, so now you'll notice the first disc that we come up says top, and so this is the top disc, and it also happens to be the top side. And so just so you know that that's right too, again, don't touch any of the surface area or get it dirty. You'll see flywheel side is what it says on the back here. So this is the top disc, that's the flywheel side, and so this is the pressure plate side. So again, this is how it would go on. So we're just basically going to unstack this and show you. Next we have our floater plate that acts like another pressure plate, and it has its nuts with lock washers on that. Now with them tightened down, they were down pretty tight. What it's going to tell us when it's on the car, okay, and we're checking this when it's on the car, but I'm going to show you what we're doing is we're taking basically our 20 thousandths here and making sure that it can fit in between that disc. If you have more than 25 thousandths, then you're going to have to rearrange it somehow, okay, with different shims and washers. And notice we have our paint mark here, and notice how that strap is on the bottom of our floating disc here. You don't want to put it on upside down when you reassemble it. Okay, again, we're putting all this in bags. These will now float right off, and so we're going to go ahead and take these. And even though these ones really shouldn't matter, we're just keeping them exactly how they came to us. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And this one required this is the 1/2 inch socket, and I also used a larger 1/2 inch drive because they had this one torqued down pretty tight. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and break these ones loose. and we're going to keep all of this hardware in its own bags too. So we have the pressure plate bolts, which were 1 through 6, and now we have what we're going to call our floater ring ones, and there's 3 of those. So I named this one floater number 1, and so as you'll see here, this is going to be the nut on the top and a crush washer right below it. We're going to take those off, floater 1, 2, and 3. And now as we lift this off on our floater ring, okay, notice this is how you could get this upside down. You want these tabs right here to be the one that touched the flywheel. So you can see if I inverted it, you could put it on backwards, and you should not, but I'm just saying it's possible to put it on backwards. So you want to keep that orientation correct. So that's what they mean by those straps being the flywheel side. Okay, next we're going to come in and take off our second disc. Okay, so this one is going to say it's the bottom. Okay, so this is the bottom disc. However, don't think that's the bottom of the disc. This is the flywheel side here. Okay, so it's the second disc or the bottom disc, but you want the flywheel side facing the flywheel. Now notice that where the floater straps were, where we take that off, there are now shims, as well as another one of the stands, as it's called, or the bigger spacer. Okay, and there were actually 2 of these little tiny shims, as you see. They came apart here. So you had 2 shims and a spacer. And they might have it set up differently however they needed to from the factory. But just wanted to show you what that looks like. And we're keeping that in our floater bag again, just keeping everything separate. So this is going to be floater number 1 is how we clocked this one. And so we're going to go ahead and put this in the bag. Okay, floater number 2 is the same thing. We had the spacer with the 2 shims on top. And I've seen other people who had these, they gave them extra shims. I didn't see any extra shims with mine, but this is how it came out. You'll also notice that under the pressure plate studs, there are also tiny shims here on the bottom. There were 2 of them, so you've got to really watch out for this hardware and make sure it does not fall off as you're disassembling this and then putting it back together when it gets to the car. So now you'll notice I have 8 holes for the 8-bolt crankshaft on the Cobra. So that's really important. If you have a Mustang GT2 valve, unless it had the Windsor engine from 99 and 2000 and half-year model in 01, you might have an 8-bolt crank for that one, but most of the GTs with the Romeo engines, the 2 valves, had 6-bolt cranks. Okay, now this flywheel was made in the USA, and it looks very similar to the stock Cobra one. You can see here where these studs are coming through the back. And something I wanted to point out, because we're going to compare this side by side by a Terminator flywheel, are these studs and how they compare. And so the main thing I want to point out is that the Terminator flywheel, for example, has marks where it has been balanced. They are slightly different. Laying these down next to each other, they're different too. And if you are keeping your stock flywheel, I believe that the Mcleod kit would then give you an adapter plate that goes onto your flywheel. You're no longer using your flywheel surface because it sits different. So just keep that in mind and look into the kits. I bought mine that came with everything that was new so that I didn't have to worry about any kind of fitment or problems. Also, something along the lines with the balancing, I believe that they want you to balance it if you're putting their new kit and retrofitting it onto your flywheel with the adapter plate. When Mcleod sends you the entire kit, it might be a little bit better balanced. I didn't seem to have any problems with vibrations or anything with the car so far. Now, there's also a lot of questions about the pivot ball stud length and all that and why it's so different for everybody. And as you can see, just with these 2 flywheels themselves, they sit differently. So it could be, that could be some of the factors that are involved. So as you'll see in the video, we really need to measure what we're installing and have measurements ahead of time before we install. Now, before we remove the bell housing and the stock clutch, we want to get some stock measurements here. So what we're doing is measuring across from the bell housing down to the diaphragm fingers. Now, if we take a measurement this way, it's 54.38 millimeters, and that is from the back side of the ruler. So there is another way to do it where you're stretching the caliper out. It's a little harder to get it on there straight because the feet have to be in there a little way. So you notice the measurements off slightly. So however you want to do it, if you want to take the measurement and then subtract the width of the ruler you're using, or do it this way where you're bringing it out, we just want to get some basic measurements. And what we came up with was that basically when the RXT is installed, it's about 6 or 7 millimeters deeper. So it's going to come towards the back of the car more. And so that's going to make us do some different things with the pivot ball length for the stud. But anyway, so we went through and got some measurements here, and check the video description. I'm going to put a very in-depth video on all the measurements that I took during this process, which was a huge amount of them. But anyway, we want to have these measurements at hand.
T56 bell housing bolts, they're all the same size except for the first two down from the top. So these two are the very top ones. The next two down on each side are the longer ones. And the case bolts are also on the T56 all the same size. If you're taking it off, not at the bell housing.
Okay, so we removed the bell housing bolts, the pressure plate, and the flywheel off the car. And so this is what the stock pilot bearing looks like. Everybody has a question if they've driven theirs in far enough, and you can see it sticks out a little bit when it's fully installed. So now we're using our puller, and I have a full video showing how to use this puller and where you can purchase it if you want. But we're going to pop the pilot bearing out of the crankshaft, and then we're just going to clean this up the best that we can. Our rear main seal looks really good, so we don't have to worry about that. And just get down in here with some brake parts cleaner. We put our pilot bearing in the freezer and then just tapped it in. And so check the video description if you want the details of how to do a clutch, but this is more focusing on the RXT, but you can see my other videos if you want. So we're going to start with our RXT here. And so the first thing we want to do is go clean any of the oil off of it. So it will have oil from being stored and shipped. And so we're taking some brake parts cleaner, and we're just going on the mating surface where the clutch is actually going to contact. Okay, so as you'll see here, it's pretty black on the rag where this was, because they want to coat it with oil so you don't get rust or anything so as it's being stored. So I've even heard to use the green brake parts cleaner. Okay, we got our new flywheel bolts and some thread locker. So we're going to go ahead and put the new flywheel up on here. Aluminum's really nice. I've dropped a steel one on my face before. But anyway, when you line this one up, you want to clock it till all the holes are lining up. It might look deceiving, but you actually have to rotate it several times until all of them line up, because they're not equally spaced. So once you get it to where everything's clocked the right way, run the flywheel bolts in, at least to stabilize it. And they're still loose right now, and so what I'm doing is cleaning off any oil that's on our new hardware as well, and putting a thin stripe of the blue Loctite. So now I'm putting them back in, and we're going to torque these down to 65 foot-pounds. So we're going to hold the crankshaft still. On the Terminator, it's a 14 millimeter Allen that you actually have to put in the front of the crank, and so that's how we can hold the crankshaft still. If you have a regular GT or another Mustang, there'll be a bolt on the crankshaft there. So as you see, I'm holding the crankshaft while torquing this down. So we're doing our star pattern, every bolt across from itself, and 65 foot-pounds is the rating. So you can also put a dab of grease on the back side of the bolt head so that it doesn't scar up the aluminum as it bolts down. And I went through and I marked every one of these to make sure that it had been torqued. And again, we're going across from each bolt as you're torquing it down, the star pattern. So everything's looking good here. Now we're going to come back in and again just make sure that this mating surface is clean. Coming back outside, we're going to clean now the floater ring plate, okay? And so be careful, you have that indication mark, the paint mark for alignment. You don't want that to come off. so that you know how to align everything. But we're going to go ahead and just wipe this one down as well and get it nice and clean. We had Justin SVT run and get a better torque wrench as well for smaller increments. Mine was for higher ones, so he ran home for a minute, which gave me a time to just enjoy the beautiful morning. So as a recap for our floater ring, remember that you have the stand, which comes first, which is the thick piece. Okay, that's called the stand, and then these are the shims, and there's 2 of them on each of the floater rings. So the stand is going to go on first, followed by the 2 shims. Then we're going to put our floater ring on. So earlier in the video, we had all of our hardware separated, and so now we're putting it back on. And so the first thing we're going to do is take the hardware off for our floater ring. And so we have the nut, then we have the crush washer, and then we have the shims. Make sure that they're on, and there's a stand, as it's called, that's under those. So refer to the front of the video if you haven't seen that. So the first clutch disc is going to say flywheel side, and then it's going to say bottom. Okay, so flywheel side hits the flywheel, and bottom means it's the bottom disc. So don't think that that's the bottom part of this one. We're going to run our alignment tool in here just to hold it in place slightly. And so now we're going to go ahead and bring up our floater ring plate. So make sure that none of those shims have fallen off the stands. And so another set of hands really helps here. Justin SVT, as always, is here helping me out, which I really appreciate. And so now I'm putting this floater ring on, and notice that I have the alignment mark going where it should be. So it's on that top right. Okay, now where the alignment mark is on this floater ring, you'll also notice that it goes down towards the flywheel. And notice we have our paint mark here, and notice how that strap is on the bottom of our floating disc here. So do not put this piece on upside down. It's possible to do so. So if the alignment mark's there, you shouldn't mess that one up, but make sure that it's going on as shown here, where you have the floater plate, and then where the floater plate strap is, it's down onto the flywheel side. Okay, so again, we had the stand, we had the shims, and now we're putting on the floater plate itself, followed by the crush washer, and now the nut. Okay, so we have all 3 of these on, and they're nice and snug. And so what we're going to do is torque this down to 25 foot-pounds. Okay, so it's not a lot, 25 foot-pounds. We did 1, 2, and 3, and we want to check now to make sure that this first disc can move. And so it's moving freely now. In fact, it's moving a little too freely. So basically, we're bringing in our feeler gauge. We're supposed to have 20 thousandths, maybe 25 thousandths at the most. But as you can see, we were getting 30 thousandths. So that's way too loose, and it can actually cause the top disc to perform differently. So we had to take it off and start over again. So we removed the floater plate. It's not fun to do this, but you want to do it right. So we're going to go ahead and take this back off and take it over to the workbench. And so the way that we're going to adjust this is changing the shims that are underneath the floater plate. So here there's 2 of them on each of these. So we're going to go ahead and take these with us and go measure them over at the table. You don't want any of these to fall and get lost either. So as we took this over to the workbench, what we were getting was basically 0.25 millimeter on these. Now sometimes I was getting a little bit higher of a reading, and it might just be because it's just such a fractional size on these. But in the end, we put back in one that was 0.25 millimeters on each of the stands, and then we took our next measurement. So we separated these out. I drew numbers on them so I know where they came from, if that was important. But basically we put a 0.25 millimeter shim back on each stand. Okay, so again, for the floater plate, 25 foot-pounds is what they want to see on this one. So each stand now had one of the 0.25 millimeter shims on it, and we took our measurement and we got our 20 thousandths clearance. So that's with each of these 3 floater ring plates torqued down to 25 foot-pounds. Okay, we checked and the disc still spun freely like it should. And so now we're assembling for the pressure plate. So you have the shim on the bottom, then the stand that came down. Okay, so again, that's a shim down there. Make sure that it's in that order. Shim, then the stand. And we're just putting these all back in. We had them individually marked in bags, as you saw earlier in the video. Now we're going to clean the pressure plate itself. So same thing, coming through with some brake cleaner and really cleaning this up. With a microfiber, it kind of grabs on this material, so maybe a different rag would have been better. But we did get the grease off it, so it looked pretty good. So just make sure that the mating surface is perfectly clean from any oils or even your fingerprints, grease, anything like that. We want it nice and clean.
Okay, so we have...
Next comes in flywheel side, and this is the top disc. Okay, now what's really important with these is with these 2 discs, they need to line up together or your input shaft is not going to go through. So here's our 26 spline input shaft tool, and this is good to use at this stage where you're sliding a pressure plate over it and everything. But in the end, you'll see us use the input shaft itself as it becomes a much better tool being metal. So anyway, we slid this up here. This one again is also clocked, and it has the alignment mark. So you see at the top right where the blue is, it's also lining up with the other blue marks to make sure that we have this clocked properly. So there's our alignment marks. Make sure that that's right. And you have a little bit of wobble here, so you want to hold this as straight as you can, and you want to spin it. And by spinning it, you're clocking both of them together so that it will line up a lot better when the input shaft goes in. Okay, so now we have our washer, followed by our crush washer, followed by our nut. Now we had these individually by bags marked, and again, this hardware might not be specific, but we just kept everything separated. So here's the input shaft itself, since we're installing that in the transmission next, and that made the best alignment tool because it's metal. You can clock it and turn it and really get it in there. And now as we're tightening these ones down in our star pattern, that's where you want to make sure everything is straight. Okay, so this one is now 35 foot-pounds, and we are not using Loctite on any of these pressure plate or floater ring hardware. Okay, Mcleod says do not use Loctite. So we used Loctite on the flywheel bolts, but that was the last time. So you want to make sure that this is even and that it sat there right. Justin SVT was holding that input shaft up in there as straight as he could as well, which helped. And I'll tell you, we put the transmission in later and it went right in. Next, we're taking a flat, just a little straight edge here and making sure that these have gone down on the diaphragm fingers enough. They should have collapsed down, and as you look in here, you can see how well both of those clutch discs are clocked together. They're perfectly lined up, and that made a huge difference when we went to put the transmission in. It went right in. So with the new clutch installed, now we're going to want to take our same measurements from the diaphragm fingers to the bell housing. And remember, if you're measuring on one side of the ruler, we need to subtract this amount or try to get a better measurement. So this one works pretty good, 48.25 millimeters if we're going from the diaphragm fingers up until we get to the back of the ruler. It's a little bit more wobbly that way, kind of harder to get a reading. So 53.35 or so was the factory one. So what we're going to do is look at those two numbers, and in this case, this is going to be a difference of about 5.1 millimeters. The new clutch comes out farther than the old one. So we're going to work with some adjustability on this using the pivot ball stud. And so here's the factory one. And as you can see, it wears out at the top. You can get some clutch vibration from that, so it needed to be replaced anyway. But if you look at the stock modular pivot ball, it's huge, so it won't work. The one that we have factory is from the T56, and the one we're using today is Mcleod 16912. And so if you look, it's the exact same length overall for the stud, but the adjustable jam nut is how we're going to be able to change how far in this pivot ball stud can go compared to the other one. Now, measuring the pivot ball stud from the factory, we're getting a pretty good reading here of about 37.11 millimeters. And so now that we have that measurement, we can take our 7/8 inch socket and we're going to put it all the way over the pivot ball stud. You could use an open end wrench too. It's very easy on the T56 with the flat case without the bell housing. Some transmissions it's harder to get a wrench angled in there. So we're going to go ahead and remove this after we have that measurement, and we're going to check the depth of the threads. The T56 Magnum apparently doesn't go in as far, so you might have to cut your pivot ball stud down if you need it to get any shorter. So as with the stock T56, we're looking at about 30 millimeters is how far that threads will go in normally. So that's deeper than what the factory pivot ball has as far as the threads, as you can see. And so we're just going to set these down and kind of take some comparisons. And check the video description because I'm going to make a video that's every measurement that I took, which was a lot of measurements. But what we're going to do now is take our new adjustable pivot ball stud and we're going to thread this one in. Now, when it's all said and done, we will use Loctite and bolt down that jam nut. So this is just for test fitting. So we'll just put this in all the way and then tighten down that jam nut, and eventually we'll do that with a wrench. With that said, now it's in as far as it can, and we're going to put the old bolt up there or take measurements using our caliper again. But as you can see, the adjustable pivot ball comes in just a little bit more than the factory one when it's all the way threaded in. So when we compare these two measurements, the factory pivot ball stud came in at 37.11 millimeters, and the new one, when it's installed all the way in, came in at almost 6 millimeters shorter than the other one. So the reading we got was 31.13. So that's going to help us because that's going to be helping bring the throwout bearing assembly away from the deeper clutch that we have now installed. So here's the factory ones just to look at. It's almost comical. There's no way that other one would work. So we're going to be using a brand new clutch fork as well here, and a new release bearing or throwout bearing. And so we'll install these, and we're going to be using some of this fully synthetic grease, and this has a dropping point of 500 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is a Ford spec compatible grease. And so here's our throwout bearing, and if you look at the front of it, the throwout bearing has this little teardrop shape to it, and so it comes to this point, and that point will be pointing downward on the clutch fork, and I'll show you where that is exactly here. But we're going to take some grease and just put it on the inside here. The bearing itself is pre and internally lubricated, so we don't have to worry about that. So on the clutch fork you have this flat area at the bottom of the clutch fork as it's headed down. So we're going to go ahead and have that point or teardrop pointing towards that. So to put the release bearing in, we're going to push down on each of these tabs with our thumbs to make sure that it goes into these grooves. And so of course make sure that the bearing is pointed away from you as you're doing this, and then you just slide the bearing up. And so as it clicks into place here, we're going to make sure that the orientation of this teardrop is pointed downward. So there it is. If you can see, it comes to the point right here. That's what's pointing down on the fork. Now the prongs on each side, just make sure that they are supporting this bearing. The bearing itself will slide up and down on those prongs as you put it onto the pivot ball and as it pivots. And you can also put some grease here on little dabs where it's going to be touching, and definitely on the inside, which we'll be putting it on the retainer sleeve as well to help with that. So on the retainer sleeve, that's the next part that we want to grease. So we're just greasing that up. The clutch fork does have some grease where the pivot ball stud goes, but we're going to add a little bit more. So we're going to slide our clutch fork on, and then we're going to make sure to grease the pivot ball stud as well. And so we're going to go ahead and just push this up, and it clicks into place. Make sure that you have some nice swing here. And so the next thing we're going to look at is our swing. Since we have shortened the pivot ball stud, it affects the way that this clutch fork will swing. If you look at the way it swings, it's almost like a door. So at one point, it will no longer be pushing that throwout bearing straight. It will start to bind up. So you can put a mark on your new pivot ball stud and adjust it. I like to go maybe one revolution at a time and then tighten down the jam nut, and then take measurements and see how it swings. Now we don't have to have it swing all the way to the front because our clutch is deeper, and so we're going to be contacting the clutch first. But you do want to take measurements, as I'll show you what we did a little bit later, and make sure that you're going to be within range where you're going to get a full travel on that clutch fork. And so starting from the factory, we had about 34.20 was the distance we had from the clutch fork to the case when the clutch cable was disconnected and we were touching the stock throwout bearing to the diaphragm fingers. So now, as you see, we kind of retracted this in more with that shorter pivot ball stud. And so if we compare our two numbers now, we have 23.87 millimeters, and so that's the difference of about 10.3 millimeters of added retraction. On the Magnum cases, I've even heard of them having to go shorter and adjust the case, but we are looking at the way that this swings, again, kind of like a door. And so, our full travel, as we measure, might get us closer to the end of the retainer sleeve, and that's where this is going to start to bind up. So you want to have the pivot ball as far out as it goes so you have a good swing, but you want it as far in as it can go so that when the diaphragm fingers of the clutch are in here, we're not already hitting the throwout bearing when we're trying to install the transmission. So to show you physically as an example, our diaphragm fingers to bell housing was about 48.25 millimeters. So if we take 48.25 millimeters and we go from the case outward, that's where the clutch is going to basically be. And so we need to make sure that our throwout bearing can be retracted far enough that it's not hitting those clutch fingers as we're installing the transmission. So for this measurement, we went straight up from the throwout bearing in the fully retracted position and measured the case to the throwout bearing. And we came out at about 45.10 millimeters. So where we were 48 millimeters from the case to the diaphragm fingers, then that means we have plenty of room and we're not going to be contacting our throwout bearing and diaphragm fingers before the transmission's installed. So we can now see we have about 3 millimeters of clearance between where the diaphragm fingers will be and where the clutch fork will be in its fully retracted position. So what this is going to look like on the car as an example, you can see when it's installed, we have just enough movement. And so if we wanted to, we could move the pivot ball in or out to adjust this if we're too close or too far away. Remember, the diaphragm fingers will start to spread out as the clutch wears, so you don't want to have it completely tight. You want to have a little bit of a gap there for it to grow into as well. You don't want to have it so you can't adjust the throwout bearing and it's stuck against the diaphragm finger. So just make sure you're getting accurate measurements from the face of the throwout bearing up to the case, and then from the case to the diaphragm fingers, which would be the bell housing to diaphragm fingers, and just make sure that you're going to have that gap. So you can see we got our 3 millimeter gap here. That's going to be perfect. As you saw when it was installed, we had just a little bit of movement forward and back on the diaphragm fingers to the throwout bearing, which is what we want. Mcleod says it takes 445 thousandths, or basically half of an inch, to disengage the clutch. So basically what we want to do is look at that measurement and make sure that our clutch travel is going to be enough. Now, starting farther back on the retainer sleeve, it shouldn't be a problem. If we were starting forward, we'd be afraid that the throwout bearing would come off of the retainer sleeve. So for us, it's about binding, when it's going to bind up, and deciding if you want to bring that pivot ball stud out or in more. Here's the factory swing. As you can see, it brings it all the way to the end. And so with the new pivot ball in place, you can see how it basically just stops that swing a little bit shorter. So we shouldn't need it to go all the way to the end, or we'll be overextending that diaphragm fingers on the clutch. So it's okay for it to start a little bit farther back, and it's okay if it starts to bind right at the very end. So from our measurements, and this was the travel that was indicated down at the clutch fork, it was 1.235 inches of travel is what it took for the clutch to fully engage on the stock system. So basically we're going to look at that amount and we're going to compare it to how much travel the clutch fork is going to make at the bottom of the clutch fork and how far that goes in, make sure it translates to our 1/2 of an inch or our 445 thousandths. So basically, as we take the measurements down here, we came in right where we needed to be. We have full clutch disengagement, as you can see by the springs and everything that's working there. Another clutch diagram shows that the clutch fork should also be perfectly straight from the pivot ball straight down when it's in the retracted position. Now, since we're also changing geometry of how it swings and everything like that, it might not be perfect. So we are using aftermarket components and trying to get it to swing on a range it wasn't really designed for. So when you're happy with where it's at, make sure you do remember to go back and put your Loctite on and put your pivot ball stud in, and then tighten down that jam nut. We tightened it down nice and firm as well. And so just remember, with the T56 Magnum, you might have some differences in the case. It might not go in as deep. You might have to cut some threads. On the stock T56, this one worked out perfect. Okay, so everything's looking good. So we're ready to put this transmission back in. So I went ahead as well to make sure that the gears were all going to shift how they should. So we brought the transmission to the car off of the jack just because to get under it, it's a little bit too tall on the transmission jack. Now as you're coming up, you almost need to angle the input shaft upward to have it point up and then straighten the transmission and go in. You can see I also did put just a small amount of grease on the very nose of the input shaft. So where the pilot bearing will ride on the nose, and also just so it'll kind of push it into the splines lightly. You don't want to sling grease on your clutch discs or anything. But anyway, we got this installed. Check the video description. I can give you links to other videos that are full step-by-step, or other things that I've made and that are similar videos to this. But we wanted to make sure that our clutch travel and everything was good before we fully installed everything. And it looks like we were getting just the range we were supposed to. I'm using the Maximum Motorsports clutch cable without the little block that it has in it, so it made the cable just a little bit longer, and that one worked perfect. Check the video description. I'll show you which cable I'm talking about. Now, something else that I was just kind of playing with a little bit is this free play elimination mod. And so basically this is something I bought years ago, and it helps push the clutch fork away so you don't have slop in the pedal. Now the question is, should the throwout bearing be constantly spinning or not? And the answer is yes. However, you don't want it spinning and having too much pressure or preload on it to where you start to disengage the clutch, or you start to burn up the throwout bearing, because it's not designed to constantly spin with a lot of pressure on it. It's supposed to barely be spinning. Now I've run both ways. I've tried it with the throwout bearing not spinning at all, using this kit to keep it from touching, and then it only spins when it's engaged, but that does give the bearing a shock before it starts. And you want to make sure that you have enough clutch travel, because if you're starting farther back and you don't have full clutch travel, then it won't disengage, and you can get locked out between gears, and you can hurt the synchros if you're not fully disengaged as you're shifting gears. So this is just something we're kind of setting up as we're setting the throwout bearing distance. We're going to make sure, if you hear that, it's just got the tiniest little click before it starts to engage, and so we can adjust that out with the firewall adjuster. So anyway, thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Check the video description. I'm going to put all the other videos that are similar to this or also related to this, as well as my Mustang Maintenance playlist. And if you're new to the channel, feel free to subscribe. Thanks, guys.